Welcome to another episode of Austin on Rails. My name is Theo Mills. I work at Shipping Easy, and we're sponsoring the food and the bar tab afterwards. We're basically an API broker for e-commerce stores, connecting them to postage providers. I know that sounds really exciting, but we have a really good, strong team. Several of us are here tonight, and we're looking to hire. We really put focus on code quality and testing, and do a feature a week about, so the clip is pretty good, and it's a lot of fun. So if anyone's looking, come talk to me. My boss will be here probably later. His name's Barry. You can talk to him. Are there any announcements, community related, that anyone has?
We're organizing Keep Ruby Weird, which is a new conference here in Austin. It'll be October 24th. We have a website at keeprubyweird.com, and we're on Twitter at keeprubyweird.
Great, did everyone hear that?
What's your name?
All right, so these guys, what's your name?
I got it.
All right.
Hi, I'm Caleb Thompson. I work at Thoughtbot with Britt over there, one of my co-organizers, along with Richard Schneeman and Terrence Lee from Heroku. We're all sort of on our free time organizing a conference called Keep Ruby Weird, and that's going to be October 24th. It's actually going to be right here downtown. We're going to do it at the Ritz, the Alamo Draft House. So we've got a CFP open, we've got the website up at keeprubyweird.com, and we're on Twitter at the same thing, keeprubyweird.
Great, thanks. Any other announcements? All right. The bathrooms. They're back there around the corner. Any questions? All right. So tonight, we've got Matt Swain coming up with Unix tricks for Rails developers. After that, we'll have a break. We have a raffle. We have some books to give away tonight. We'll also take a poll on who's hiring and who's looking for work. So when that happens, look around the room and everybody can kind of get together during the break. And then after that, at 8:15, I'm going to talk about refactoring. And then finally, after all that's done, we're going to go to BD Riley's, which is on 6th Street, down Brazos around the corner. And Shipping Easy is going to be covering the tab for that as well, so please come out. And last but not least, thank you to Capital Factory for hosting this since I've been coming in 2006, I don't know, 2005 maybe? I don't know, they've been doing it as long as I think the group's been around. So thanks to them once again, and I'll hand it over to Matt Swain. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. That's true. I'll bring you the mic.
Actually, I just sit that around the corner.
That's true.
Whoa.
Nice. Five fingers.
It's a mic drop.
Just want to say thank you to them to Shipping Easy for sponsoring our drinks and our pizza tonight. Let's give them a round of applause real quick. That's pretty awesome. Thank you.
Where are the bathrooms again?
So the bathrooms are around the corner. That one. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
All right, sweet. Okay, can everybody read this? So, apologies in advance to all of the Windows Ruby people in the room. This talk is going to be pretty Unix focused, but I think that a lot of the concepts will kind of apply if you're using PowerShell or Cygwin or some sort of like Bash emulator on the Windows system. So don't leave yet. You can leave after you figure out my talk is really boring. So anyway, tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Unix and why it's kind of fucked up, and introduce newcomers to some features that they can use in the Unix shell to make developing on it a more pleasant experience. So to begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Unix. So that command prompt that you look at every day when you're working on OS X or your Linux development machine has a really long history behind it, and it's kind of tied to the development of the C programming language and the Unix operating system itself. So Linux and Mac OS X are actually flavors of Unix, and I'm sure some hardcore people out there would like to argue with me about those things, but a lot of the conventions that we take for granted today were essentially developed in the 60s and 70s. So if you can imagine a bunch of developers in the room arguing about how best to implement a feature, which I'm sure you probably deal with every day, a lot of the results of those arguments ended up in the operating system that you use today. And for better or for worse, we're kind of stuck with them. So Unix was originally developed by a guy named Ken Thompson in 1969. He worked at Bell Labs, which is a division of the evil empire that we all know and love as AT&T. It was developed in assembler, and a short time later, one of Thompson's colleagues named Dennis Ritchie implemented the C programming language. Subsequently, most of the Unix development occurred in C, and the language and the OS kind of evolved around each other. So the core of the Unix operating system is called the kernel, and it's the beast that's responsible for doing things like loading data from disks and loading programs into memory and killing jobs and translating your key presses into usable input. It's an abstraction so that you don't have to waste your time like writing assembly language instructions to do these things, and in a way it makes computing a whole lot easier. At least for hardcore computer scientists. However, for normal people like us, system programming can be kind of dense and impenetrable. So in 1971, Thompson wrote a little program called SH. It was a very simple command interpreter, and it made working with Unix a whole lot easier for just regular users. No longer did this stalwart graduate student have to write C code to like copy a file from one place to another, or print hello world to a terminal. They could just type into this shell and get results really quickly. So Ken Thompson's shell was pretty nice, all things considered, but it didn't really allow people to write scripts or other fancy things like that. It was basically just like run this program, dump the output of this into that, and so on. So glossing over a whole lot of history, in 1977, AT&T released the Bourne shell, and it came with a ton of features for scripting and automation. It's named after Stephen Bourne, who is shown right here. This shell became a standard in a way, and a lot of the concepts are still in use today. So, a bunch of stuff happened, like New Coke, and Crystal Pepsi, and Ronald Reagan, and like the Cold War, and Snuggies and stuff like that, and Game of Thrones came out, and then you have today, and you have a shell called Bash, which stands for the Born Again shell, because the Bourne shell was rewritten over and over again and eventually evolved into this, and it's actually the default shell that you will use on an OS X system and most Linux systems that you develop on. And without further ado, I'd like to kind of talk about how it works and some of the features involved in that shell. So let's start with input and output. So you wouldn't be able to do much with computers without input and output. They effectively just generate heat and waste electricity. So Unix's philosophy is kind of developed around the idea that everything is a file. Your video card is a file, your sound card is a file, your hard drive is a file. I mean, it's kind of an oversimplification, but essentially a lot of tasks reduced to just kind of moving data from one file to another. So, for example, you can play a sound file simply by dumping them into a sound card file. So you cat don't stop believin.wave into your sound card file, dev DSP, and it will actually play the song. But the real magic that I want to talk about is that little greater than sign. And that greater than sign is called, in nerdy terms, IO redirection. So what that greater than sign tells the shell is that you want to redirect the output from the program on the left to the file on the right. In this case, the sound card. And in fact, if you leave that greater than dev DSP off and just type cat don't stop believing that way, it will not play the song. Instead, you'll see a lot of garbage just spew across the screen. Not the lyrics, just a bunch of bytes. What can you do with this and Rails? Well, I'll use a lot of examples from Rails for the rest of the talk, because I know that's why you guys are here. So let's say you guys use Rails Runner probably every once in a while, if not every day. And let's say you've written a script like this, where you're just going to print all the user login names on your system. Well, let's say you want to output that to a file. Well, you can redirect the output to logins.txt, and it will just dump the output of the command on the left to the file on the right. And then all the logins will be in logins.txt when you're done. So that actually overwrites the file. If you want to append to a file that's already there without overwriting it, you can simply use 2 greater than signs instead of 1. Similarly, there's another symbol, the less than symbol, and that means accept input from a file. And this is useful when you're running like MySQL commands and other things too. This is a way that you could load your structure.sql file without loading the Rails environment. You just essentially take the contents of the file on the right and input it into the command on the left. But perhaps the coolest IO redirection symbol is the pipe. And you can use this to connect the output of one program to the input of another. Just going back to our Rails Runner example, you can actually pipe the commands of that script that prints the user logins to the input of the Unix command sort. And what that does is just sorts everything lexicographically, so you'll end up with a list of users sorted alphabetically. And that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about regarding IO redirection. It's actually a pretty deep topic, and you'll see links scattered throughout this talk that will point you to places where you can read more about them. And of course, I'll upload this after the talk so you guys can get to it. But this concepts will be a little important for things coming down the pipe. So anyway, so moving on. Let's talk about moving around. So I'm sure you've been in a situation before where you're typing a really long, horrible command that your DevOps dude told you to type into your terminal, and you're like 4 lines into it, and then you see that you made a typo like on the second word. So what do? Well, you know, a lot of beginners will just hold down that arrow key for like 40 seconds until you're like at the right place, and then you can fix it from there. But there's actually a whole lot of shortcuts that you can use to like make your life a whole lot better. And these are really all about muscle memory, so just like getting them under your fingers is great. But these are some of the most common ones that I use every day. My favorite is especially this like Control-X, then Control-E, and it opens the command line that you're on in an editor. So you can just like use Sublime Text to like edit your command line, then save it and run it. So it's pretty sweet for working on like huge commands with HereDocs and all sorts of things. Also, navigation is a lot easier by using some of the shell's built-ins. These are shortcuts that can help you get around your file system without having to type too much. And here's a big list of them right here. So, for example, cd tilde, that'll move you into your home directory no matter where you are in the system. Cd minus will move you into the last directory that you were just in. The Unix command pwd will show you which directory you're currently in. And then there's a lot of really cool things around something that's called a directory stack. If you do pushd, for example, it will basically push the directory following the command onto the stack and move you into it. And then you can run the command popd, and it will pop the last directory you were in, or pop that directory off the stack and move you to the directory that you were in before. So you can kind of keep track of like where you've been if you just use these commands all the time. And if you type the dirs command, it'll actually show you all the directories on the directory stack. So it's kind of like a working history, almost kind of like browser breadcrumbs for your shell. The other thing that helps moving around is the tab key. And if you're not using the tab key in your shell, then I feel sorry for you because you're doing way too much typing. But the tab key really is like your best friend. Learning it effectively will save you like a ton of keystrokes and keep you from getting carpal tunnel syndrome. But don't quote me on that to your doctors because I'm not a doctor. Anyway, in Bash, you can type a part of a command and hit tab to have it automatically complete it for you. This works on both command names, directories, files, etc. So, in fact, if there's any ambiguity about what you're typing, like Bash will give you a list of things that it thinks that you want. So, in this example, I'm in my Rails folder, I type bun tab tab, and it brings up all the commands on my system that match bun followed by something else, right? Probably looking for bundler, probably not dunzip2, but if I'm going to cd into a directory, I can type cd t tab tab, and it'll list all the directories that start with t that are in the current directory that I'm in. If you want to jump into the test directory, you can just type cd te tab enter, and then you'll go into test, which saves you like one keystroke. And if you imagine that amortized over like 20 years of a development career, that's a whole lot of typing. So yeah, moving on, I want to talk about the bash history, which is actually one of the coolest features that the shell has to offer, and one of the most underutilized that I've seen when newcomers start working with the Unix programming environments. So, have you ever been in a situation where you just like can't remember a command that you typed like weeks ago, or even yesterday, or even this morning? Or you just can't remember the arguments that you passed to Git like the other day, and those can be pretty gnarly. Well, Bash kind of has you covered in those scenarios. There's a really extensive history management feature built into the shell, which keeps track of every command you've ever entered into the system, up to a configurable limit. You don't want to fill your hard drive with all of your Bash history, or maybe you do like me, because I set my Bash history to like millions of lines. But anyway, so how do you tap into this stored history? Well, one of the easiest ways is to just type the command history. And when you do that, you're going to get a big list of commands that you've ever entered, and they're all going to be numbered like this. And to execute a command that you've run before, all you have to do is type exclamation point and the number of the command. So if I wanted to execute railc, I just type exclamation point 26 and railc should file it. There's a nice little handy shortcut even for executing the last command that you ran, like probably rate test, like all the time, right? So exclamation point will just run the command that you ran before. And like any other Unix command, you can actually pipe it through other programs on the system. So if you only want to see commands that you've entered that match the word Rails, you can just pipe it through grep. And for those of you who don't know, grep is a Unix command for filtering text. And it will only print the things that match Rails. So you'll get line 26 and nothing else. So that's pretty useful. But Bash also has a really sweet search feature. And to access that, all you have to do is hit Control-R. And once you do that, you can type a fragment of a command that you've entered before, and it'll just search through your entire history. And you can keep hitting Control-R until you find the one you want, and then when you do, you hit Enter. I use this probably all the time. If they took this away, I would just quit programming and start farming or something. So anyway, once if you don't want to execute the command that you found, you can hit Control-J and just edit the command line, like using some of the moving options I showed you before. So that's all really, really sweet. It is also kind of a deep subject. You can do all sorts of really neat, fancy things with it, and I encourage you to follow the link to check it out. So another friend that can save you a lot of typing is the bash alias. Now, let's say you have a really long, shitty command that you find yourself entering like thousands of times per day. And even searching for it with Control-R just sucks, because maybe it starts with R, and everything else on your system is like Rails this, Rails that. Right? So you're going pretty crazy, but there is help for you. You can use bash aliases. And aliases are simply just user shortcuts that you can define that will make your life a whole lot better. So for example, you might enter bundle exec Rails console testing like a few thousand times per day. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just type RCT? So you can do that just by saying alias RCT equals quotes and the command that you want it to run. So now, every time you type RCT, it's going to execute that whole command. Pretty sweet, huh? This is especially useful for the git commands because there's like a billion of them, and I use stuff like this like every day. I think my git aliases in my configuration files just are like pages long. So like, git commit -a is a lot better. Just type GCA. So also a deep subject. Give you another link. Encourage you to follow it. Check it out. But I'm going to have to talk about config files too because I'm talking about all these commands that you can enter. How do you persist those between sessions? How do you make sure that those commands still work when you spawn an entirely new tab in your terminal? Well, Bash has configuration files that it executes every time it launches, and unfortunately they can be kind of different depending on which Unix you're using. If you're using OS X, you're going to want to use the configuration file in your username.bash profile. If you're working on Linux, you're probably going to want to use bashrc. There's actually a lot of reasons for this that I'm not going to go into right now, so come talk to me afterwards if you want to know the details, or just follow the link and you can figure out why things are the way they are. But in general, the files themselves are just lists of commands that will run every time you open a new shell. So notice the first couple lines here, I said that I set my command line history to like 1,000,000 or something like that. Those are the variables that you would set to do that. And then you can have your aliases after that. And then every time you do like Control-T on your terminal.app, it's going to bring it up and it's going to run through all this stuff. And then everything should work. All your aliases will be persisted and such. So I couldn't not talk about ZSH because this is a shell that I use like every day. So yeah, woo, ZSH. Raise your hand if you use ZSH here. Like everybody does. Sweet, that's awesome. So I guess everybody knows that ZSH is like Bash on crack, and it's like totally amazing. And it comes with this like, one of the things that makes it really amazing is it comes with these like community supported set of tools called OMyZSH that are supported by a whole lot of people, and they make the experience like totally rock. For those of you who don't know about OMyZSH, check out their GitHub page at GitHub Roby Russell OMyZSH. Follow the install instructions and it will totally blow your mind. But like Bash, it's basically a superset of Bash. ZSH is a superset of Bash. It does everything that Bash can do and more. Although some things it does a little differently, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. But once you have it installed and you couple it with the OMyZSH plugins, like it'll do things like show you which branch you're in when you're CD to a directory, like which Git branch you're in. It'll show you whether or not there's dirty commits. It'll make everything nice and colorful and pretty. It'll spell check your commands. So if you like totally screw up typing, it'll say, oh, did you mean SSH, not SHH? It's really pretty sweet. So here's like a really great example of some of the awesome things that it can do. Like I told you about tab completion before and being able to complete commands and directories, but ZSH is even smarter and it can actually, in some cases, tab complete all the options available to a program. So if you're using Git and you don't remember the options, I mean, who remembers all the options to Git, right? All you have to do is type git tab tab, and it'll give you this big list of inline documented options that you can pass to that command, and it's like super sweet. It's like you don't even have to Google. And here's an example of it correcting exit. So if you type EXTI, which is something that I do all the time because I type it so fast, it'll say, hey dude, did you mean exit? Yes, no, always. Even CD minus, which in Bash takes you to the last directory that you were in, is enhanced. You can type CD minus tab and it'll bring a numbered list of all the directories that you've ever been in, and you can just say, oh, okay, I want to go to number 2 or number 1, and it'll take you right to the directory in that list. So, that about concludes my talk to this brief introduction to the Unix shell, and I really wanted to open up the room to a lot of questions. It's kind of a deep subject, and I wanted to just kind of gloss over some of the really nice, easy features that can just kind of get your productivity skyrocketing pretty fast. Or you can come talk to me at the meetup afterwards, and I'd be happy to talk to you all day about ZSH and why it's awesome and super cool and you should be using it and stuff. So, any questions? Oh, here are my references too, so. Like MLA documentation. Just like college. No questions? None?
You want to explain OMyZSH a little bit?
Yeah, I'll talk about OMIZSH a little bit. So OMIZSH is it's a Git repository that references a lot of other Git submodules, and it's a whole lot of like auto-completion plugins for ZSH and color themes and spell checking things, so that you can just install it, and like it has a lot of out-of-the-box stuff that you might be using. So it has like spell correction stuff for like Rails commands. It has auto-completion stuff for Rails commands. It has auto-completion stuff for Git. And you'll see that like once a new tool comes out, since it's so actively supported, for example, like the AWS command line interfaces for managing Amazon instances, somebody will write an OMIZSH plugin and they'll just upload it to the community project, and then you'll be able to auto-complete all the different AWS commands like really easy. So you'll type AWS tab and it'll say like launch instance or shut down instance or manage my auto-scaling groups, and you don't really have to remember what all the command line options were and run to the man pages and run to the documentation. And it's just like there's a lot of churn on it all the time. If a Node.js like library comes out that everybody starts using, you can pretty much guarantee that a OMIZSH plugin is probably going to be made for it like within days of it coming out. So
it also auto updates itself.
Yes, it auto updates itself. In fact, it can get kind of annoying sometimes when you like open it. It's like using Windows in a way. You open up your ZSH cell and it's like, hey, there are updates to apply. Would you like to do this? Yes or no? And of course, like it's right in the middle of you like, I just want to tab and I want to type something real quick, and it's like, oh, I hit the Y key, now I have to wait for it to get pulled and like all that stuff. Anyway, so yeah, really good stuff, really fun. Yeah.
How well does it work over SSH?
How well does it work over SSH? Specifically ZSH or? Yeah, so one of the reasons why I talked about Bash first is that it's always like the default on every system that you SSH into. And depending on what your system administrator situation is at your company, I mean, they may want to keep it that way. So if the system administrator is in charge of the machines that you're SSHing to or allowing you to do things like install OMIZSH, then it works great. You just SSH in and it'll work the same as it is on your local machine. It's really pretty sweet. ZSH comes installed by default on most Linux distros nowadays. It's just not set as the default shell. And a lot of people are kind of reluctant to change that. So there is a lot of value to just learning like what Bash can do beyond, what Bash can do that ZSH maybe does better. But if you know the Bash way, you know that any server that you SSH into, you're probably going to be covered. But hey, if you can install ZSH on your machine and you can install OMIZSH on your machine, that's awesome. Like I use it everywhere I can. Anybody else? How's it going, Barry? All right, well, I guess that about wraps it up. If you have any other questions, just come find me during the meetup, and I'd be happy to talk to you. I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so let's see hands of people who are hiring right now. All right, look around. Now hands of the people who are looking. Okay. Ooh. That's hiring too. All right, well let's
have a meetup here during the break.
Yeah, so both sides of the fence, come up here, try to mingle, try to meet each other. I'm gonna set up this raffle. We have how many books? 3? Oh. We got 3 books to give away, so if you want to be a part of the raffle, come type your name in here.
What are the books?
They are Scope Enclosures.
That's an Austin author, by the way. Kyle.
Oh, is it? Kyle Simpson is an Austin author, supposedly. DOM Enlightenment, if you have always wondered about the DOM and wanted to learn more, and browser networking. So come on up, type your name in, come on up, meet somebody, get a new job, and we'll meet back in about 15 to 20 minutes. Thanks.
Integrity.
He's pretty. Me either. Just like second time I've come in. All right. I'll go ahead and just. Different cohort too. Hi. They're back in so we create like pretty much I actually we're actually what's your
So anyway, that's kind of right now.
Yeah. So it's your main
I guess it sounds like we initially have this we do it every eventually we try to do we're looking right now at like there's a lot of things like I guess like just want to like now I'm staring at so like I'm doing that. Research and make sure it's other next week. But anyway, that's so yeah, we have that. Broadcast audience is mostly
Okay, thank you. My last name is apparently.
So yeah.
Spell your name wrong? Oh, no, you're good.
This guy, I took his class. He does like, he did like a class over the weekend, which was not enough time. I think he normally does like a 3-day class. And he also has it on GitHub. It's super heavy into like JavaScript theory and nitty-gritty stuff that people don't like. But anyway, so he's kind of like enlightened me of how
Hey, Matt.
my stack is it's basically like an airline service, the company's big that I didn't know it. I think that was
but they all talk to each other.
It's like a router. Something about recording that's creepy. I don't know. Why do I talk with
Yeah, and you know,
I get it like every so often where they have some
No, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, it's not about like everybody's like small. There's still like
All right. Has everyone found a job? Everyone's employed? Let's go ahead and start the raffle. All right, congratulations. All right, let me get my talk going. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about refactoring outside the Rails stack. And I don't know how many of you have seen this show or seen this episode, but I about fell out of my chair when I heard the words Ruby on Rails on HBO. This is probably the first and last time that those words will ever be broadcast on television. But anyhow, it was a bit of a disparaging comment about Rails. I think we probably can all agree you can't really master Rails on a weekend. And in fact, developers have been trying to figure out how to write good Rails apps since it came out, so for a decade now. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to go through a blog post that Code Climate wrote a couple years ago that kind of collected a lot of patterns to help ease the pain of developing Rails apps. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about some trends that I've seen in the Rails community, specifically gems. So back in the day, if you wanted to do backgrounding or queuing, we used delay job. If you wanted to upload files, everybody remember attachment foo? You remember that naming trend of everything foo for a bit? And of course, when Rails first came out, it was a big deal because it espoused using test-driven development. So we were all about test-driven development. But then, a couple years later, we no longer use delay job. We switched to rescue. Paperclip usurped attachment foo, and BDD, behavior-driven development. You got to do it. You got to be using Cucumber. We were all about that for a while, and then come around today, Sidekick has replaced Rescue as the queuing library. Carrier Wave has sort of replaced Paperclip, but it uses uploader objects, which are a bit cooler. And of course now TDD is dead, so we've just totally gotten rid of testing altogether. So there's also been this trend ever since Rails started getting popular is this question we ask ourselves: how can we make developing Rails less painful? And the pain that we experience typically is when it's hard to write tests for something, or it's hard to refactor. And early on, when Rails first came out and kind of redefined what MVC at least meant to Java developers like myself using stiff MVC frameworks, the tendency was to put everything in the controller. The controller controls the app, right? So why not put all the business logic in the controller? That became painful enough that a couple years later, in 2006, James Buck wrote a blog post called Skinny Controller, Fat Model, where he addressed this pain that everyone was experiencing, putting all their business logic inside the controller. And the recommendation was to move that logic into the model, closer to the domain. Make the model kind of the primary focus of your app. Move it out of the controller. Well, that was kind of like throwing gasoline onto a fire because the Rails way, the Rails prescription for what the model should do includes quite a number of things. It includes input validation, association macros, wiring up the associations between different models, callbacks, which call other models, which have callbacks, which call other models. There's even the idea of including view logic, just the idea of validates acceptance of or validates confirmation of. Those are really view-oriented validations. I personally don't think they belong in the model. If you're building a model from the console, you don't want to have to accept some terms. You don't need to do that. It really feels more view-related. And then, of course, persistence. Let's save all this stuff to the database. And then, of course, now we've got the domain logic. We're moving all the business logic. And this is what we all kind of jumped on after that blog post. And for a while, that's how we kept writing Rails apps, which slowly got larger and larger. So the problem with that, the problem with putting all this stuff in the model is really kind of the same problem with any large class. You end up with too many methods, In some cases, people are writing methods that are way too big. There's too many dependencies, for instance, the callbacks, which call other models, which call other models. There is no single responsibility principle if that's something you believe in. There's a lot of roles that the model is playing, and all these things make it kind of hard to just grasp what it is your model or your class is doing. And so it's harder to test. It's just not, there's a lot of pain in trying to write a test, and there's a lot of pain when you have to come to refactor. It feels, well, it feels like kind of like a house of cards, which is a slide that's coming up, and I meant to wait till the slide comes up. But I'll say it again when it comes up. So today, we've kind of moved away from the idea of fat models, and now the trend is to move a lot of these things, a lot of these responsibilities that Rails kind of has granted the model, and move them outside the standard Rails stack. This is not something you would read in the Rails, what's that name of that book?
Rails.
No, not the Rails way. I'm sorry, I'm
Agile
blanking
Web
out.
Development with Rails.
What?
Agile Web Development.
Yes, Agile Web Development with, yes, thank you very much. They pretty much stick to the prescription. And the kind of sad thing about that is anytime the community has come out with some new framework that they get excited about, be it RSpec or form objects or service objects, the Rails royalty calls it cargo culting. And that essentially means that we're just kind of following the herd and doing it just because everybody else is doing it, and not deriving any true value out of it, which is kind of sad. But at the same time, the dude is racing cars and winning races, so maybe I don't really know what I'm talking about. He's obviously achieved some level of hyper success, but the Rails team did eventually kind of concede that yes, there are some issues with having the models do all these different things, and they came back with concerns. And concerns are kind of well, they're really just modules, and all they do is move all that complexity and hide it away in the closet, in basically separate modules where the behavior is still mixed into your model. It still has all these responsibilities. It's just when you open the class, oh, it's not there. So you don't really have to think about it. But here we go. But your model is a house of cards. So, and that's what I was talking about, the pain of trying to create tests and trying to refactor. And I can understand why someone would say that TDD is dead if they're having to write tests for these bloated models. You want TDD to be dead because you don't want to write a test for something like that. It hurts really bad. So that's how we come back to this blog post that Code Climate wrote a couple years ago. And they didn't invent these patterns, but they kind of collected these patterns and trends that have come up over really, I guess, the past 10 years at different times, and kind of collected them into a single blog post that has been a great reference point for me. So I'm going to go through them now. We'll start with value objects. So a value object is really a simple object who it's not about its identity, it's about the value that it has. And typically these things do not change. So you set a value object with its attributes, and it keeps those attributes. When would you use them? If you have a group of attributes that are related and normally you don't have to have logic associated with it, but oftentimes it's some sort of conversion logic that involves that group of attributes, such as phone numbers, I guess. Money I use quite often. I've done weight. I guess addresses could also be useful, but I wasn't sure if the code samples would be big enough. So here's an example of a value object. It's kind of a very simple money value object that deals in cents. So the actual model, the order model, stores its cost in actual cents as an integer in the database. But you want to be able to also associate currency and translate it into something that looks more like what a cost would look like with a decimal point. So really all you need to do is create a new method on the class and instantiate a new money object. The old way of doing this, the Rails way, which has since been deprecated, thank God, in Rails 4, is this composed of macro. And as you can see, the Ruby-ish way of doing it compared to what this macro does, it's so much easier to read. And anyway, I'm glad that is gone. It looks like a mess to me. I guess there are some libraries to help you. The MoneyGem I've used frequently. It's a lot more, has a lot more complex operations than the simple money example I showed you. And of course, Compose is deprecated, but really you just need plain old Ruby objects to implement this. All right, so decorators. Decorators are really just a standard design pattern, their original Gang of Four design pattern, and they wrap an object with functionality, and that object can still operate with its identity, with it's a user object wrapped in a decorator can still act as a user object. So it maintains the existing functionality of the object, and it avoids inheritance in favor of composition. And there's a couple of good opportunities to use a decorator. One is if you want to remove callbacks from your model and just wrap the callbacks around your model at the specific points that you need to use them. I have an example of that. You can also wrap your model with display logic. So if you want to alter how its attributes look when you display them on the page or in a view, you can do that. Yeah, so this is kind of the classic example of a decorator where you have a coffee object and the sugar and milk decorators accept the coffee object as a component and overwrite the cost and decorate it with some extra cost. So in the end, you would get, I meant to put the result there, but what do you get? $1.60. So now your cup of coffee costs $1.60. And this can be useful as a callback replacement. So here's a registration notifier that basically I know everyone's done some sort of after save where they send an email. Well, you can actually pull that out into a separate object, pull it out of the model, and only when you need to send the registration confirmation or notification at the specific point that someone registers, you can wrap it and have it override the save method. So the decorators are typically delegating to their parent object or their wrapped object. I don't know, I find that really useful. Draper is another example of a decorator for the view. So you can it takes the wrapped object, and you can add display only a lot of stuff that we had been typically putting in our models, such as you have a user with a full name, but really that's only a display only requirement. Well, with Draper, you can decorate the user object and have full name available to your views, and you can do other things like add links. I know I've actually gone a little nuts with Draper and had subclasses depending on the role of the user that's playing. So an admin would, a link to edit would have point to an admin section that gave you more abilities, whereas the subclass of the standard user decorator, which just allows somebody to edit themselves. So I've gone a little nuts with this. I don't necessarily recommend that. It can get hairy quickly, but I do think Draper is a good tool if you still have views and aren't using JavaScript and VC framework. So now we're into view objects. What is a view object? A view object is just an object that represents a portion of a view. Typically, they're a type of widget, and often it might be time for some sort of object if you find that you're using helper methods whose signatures pass down the same object over and over again. It might be a good time to take all those methods, put them into a class where you can maintain state and don't need to keep passing those arguments down. Or maybe you should just be using Ember instead. Here, this is an example actually directly from the blog post. I was trying to avoid just lifting directly from the blog post, but this seemed like a good enough example of a widget. And they recommend using what's called the two-step view, which is basically for every view object, you have a corresponding partial, view partial. So there would be a donut chart partial that would accept the donut chart to get the data out of it and then render inside the partial. There's also a framework that I personally have never used, but it looks like it follows directly the two-step pattern cells, UView cells. All right. It seems pretty cool, but once again, you have a view object, and then the render cell will render the partial that's tied directly to that view object. Next, policy objects. So policy objects are a read-only object that basically takes you're moving all your predicate methods out of the model. So you can move a lot of stuff related to authorization, just really any questions that you're asking of your model. Let's see. So here's an example actually that I took from our code base and kind of shrunk down a bit. We have an auto upgrade policy. So once someone trips a certain threshold of shipments that they're allowed to ship for their subscription or the given month, we kick off an auto upgrade process. And this is a policy that lets us know, hey, you know, this account has exceeded that threshold. So I have really one predicate method here, eligible, that wraps quite a few other predicate methods. It's kind of a bit of a complex business rule there. But then I can use that wherever I need to check to see if somebody is eligible for an auto upgrade or not. This one I got off a blog post. It's a little more complex. He's using the policy object. He actually has a couple of predicate methods on there. He's actually using it to return a specific status. Well, what I really wanted to point out was you can also put the policy object back into your model and just delegate back out to it. I normally don't do that. I kind of like keeping the policy objects standalone and just using them where I need them specifically. But again, that's just another example. Pundit is a gem that uses policy objects in, I guess, a slightly more, well, it follows CRUD, basically. So if you guys have ever used CanCan, this would kind of be a replacement as an authorization gem. And it gets pretty finite to the protecting the CRUD operations. As you can see, the post policy has an update predicate method that gets checked in the post controller update method with that authorized post. And you can also call it from a view if you needed to check to see if you needed to render the edit post link. So that's a gem you can check out if you're interested in using a self-contained library. Okay, any questions so far? Scott? You're writing? Okay.
I have 6 pages of questions. I think I'll let you get through this next page.
Okay, all right. I didn't write the blog post, Scott, so. All right, so now we're on to query objects. So query objects, it is an encapsulation of a query. When would you use it? Well, if you have a ton of scopes in your model and you were able to kind of group them together into kind of a common business function, I think that's an opportunity to use a query object. Some good use cases for that are reporting. If you're having to generate a lot of complex queries to create a report, or likewise if you have some sort of search that has a lot of different parameters attached to it. So here's an example of a reporting query. This is a new users query. You instantiate it with a relation, and you can have different options that kind of just encapsulate this very specific query. They recommend delegating, well, in this one I've actually delegated a couple methods, but you can actually delegate directly to the relation find each, and then you can do something like we see on the right, where you're iterating through each of the results and sending a welcome notification. Again, all these, I'm not saying that you need to do this necessarily for all models, and this is just an opportunity to, if you have a really bloated model and you kind of have some standalone functions, to put them in separate objects that are finite, so you can actually grasp what the purpose is of the class, and therefore more easily testable. And it really just depends on your business logic, if it makes sense to do that, or the size of your app. This is something from our code base as well. It's our API where people can search orders against our system. And I wrapped this stuff in an orders query object. I'm using a gem called Virtues, which I really like. It has, you declare your attributes, and you can actually specify coercers to change those values as they're coming in to the object. And here I've created some custom coercers to basically put defaults. If the values coming in through our API don't exist, or they're incorrect, or they're out of bounds, and kind of push them back to what they need to be. Yeah, so that's an example of using it for search. That's how you execute it on the right. Here's another example I found on the web where if you wanted to maintain the chainability of your scopes, you can actually extend the relation with a module inside the class and kind of keep that chainability down below if that's something you're interested in. Okay, now form objects. Out of all these patterns, form objects are probably the one I've ended up using the most. Well, that's not true, so I'm kind of going nuts with service objects. But the form object, the value, I really see the value in using that. You should use a form object when you have more than one model getting saved, typically, so you can avoid using accepts nested attributes for, which I've run into a lot of complications using. Or, as I was saying earlier, if you're using these validations that really seem more view-centric. Here's an example of a password form. So here we've got the validates confirmation of, basically you're changing your password, and you can initialize it with the model that you're going to act against, and then you actually call submit inside the controller with the params, and set everything manually, check if it's valid, and return true or false. It's pretty simple. Let's see. Here's an example of doing, and again using, well, actually I forgot to mention. So this module you can include, active model, includes a lot of, this is kind of a plain Jane form object. So it includes a lot of active records, kind of helper functions, including the validation, a few other things. Some things that it doesn't include are multi-parameter dates. It doesn't include a mechanism to parse those as they come in, but it does include quite a bit. And you can even handle nested attributes using kind of a plain Jane active model, which is something I had to Google for, but if you want to use form4 for sub-objects, for instance, or child objects, all you need to do is specify this attributes setter. So if you have child objects that are email addresses, then once you add the email addresses attributes setter to this method and use forms4 in conjunction with it, it just works. So that was a nice find for me. So form objects, I use them, I think they're kind of misnamed because I actually use them for our order intake API as well. And really, it's not a form that's getting submitted, it's an API call that has a bunch of JSON attributes getting thrown at us, and I want to validate those. It's really the same thing as a form submission, but I call it a validator. Yes?
So, just kind of based on what you're talking about, I probably a general question. Why wouldn't you just bundle the attributes you're trying to set in the various models and use the form tag helpers as opposed to just form4? And then just sort it out on the controller, because the controller can write to email.
I didn't quite understand. So I'm using...
You're talking about using embedded nested style?
Yeah.
Why would you use this kind of method versus just using form tags and then sorting it out on the controller?
Well, fields for gives you kind of the convenience if you have child objects of automatically rendering as many field sets as you need for that set of objects. That's kind of following the standard Rails pattern for a form that has nested objects in it. So if you're using a form object, the way you can kind of get that behavior back is by adding this attributes equals method, in this case email addresses attributes equals, that will allow you to use field for in kind of a standard Rails fashion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're explaining. I just don't understand why that's better than just bundling the attributes in an array, a parameter array.
This might partially answer that. So another thing that Active Model is giving you is Active Model naming, which means that you can pass this object to Form 4.
Right.
Which doesn't tell you a lot with the vanilla Rails, but with simple form fields, simple Form 4, sorry, then you get all of the error classes and all of that stuff.
Right, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, so there is this includes the errors hash that you get in the validation, and like you said, now with Rails 4, I think previously you actually had to specify what the name of the object was going to be represented to as Form 4.
Not if you added Active Model naming.
Okay.
It'll reflect on the class name.
Okay, but if you have a different class name, if you want it to act as a different, essentially including this allows you to use the Form 4 helper, the form helpers, as you would in a normal Rails fashion.
While still getting, so the point is to be able to pull out your validation and coercion out of your model,
right,
and into something else. That's the whole point.
You also inevitably end up with passing arguments from the view to the model to control behavior. Like I want to save all these things. So as soon as you start passing extra attributes to the model, that through the controller it feels dirty. You're doing something wrong. Like the attributes the model gets should just be for persistence. So extracting them into this form object lets you deal with any kind of intermediary business logic that you need to deal with before you actually then take those attributes and try to save them.
And also, if you have, especially with the user, because you have a registration and versus edit, and you tend to, at least I have in the past, have a lot of validations that have a lot of conditional logic on create, but if it's on update, do this. And using form objects allows you to get away from that because each form object is a different use case. And you can validate differently depending on the use case and kind of move that stuff away from the model and let the model just worry about final database valid. Like it is imperative that this be this way before it hits the database, but the form objects let you handle n number of use cases using the exact same models, basically. So this is just an example of kind of using the same form object idea, but outside of a form. Again, I'm using virtues here, and I'm even handling my child objects errors as well. Now, if you want to go kind of hardcore into form objects, you can use a gem called Reform. It's got quite a few extra little features on it. It also uses virtues for coercion, has the option to read-only fields, it handles child objects, has many, and the main reason I've used this is so I can still use multi-parameter dates if that's a convenience you need, and because it's very specific about what attributes it accepts, you don't need strong parameters in your controller. Okay, so service objects. A service object is an object that encapsulates a complex write operation. It's kind of the sister object to a query, or not a query object, a policy object, which only handles read operations. This one is all about the write operations. When should you use it? Well, if you have some sort of business process that involves multiple models, if the business logic is fairly complex, or if it also interacts with an external service, that's probably a good time to use a service object. These are trends I've seen in service objects. Normally they have one callable action. Oftentimes it's call. I've also used run. It also includes kind of a class method with the same name as a convenience, so you don't have to instantiate and then call. You can just call it directly off the class. And there's kind of weird class naming conventions around this. Sometimes I've read that people are going to kind of phrases versus nouns. So create registration versus registration creator versus something that's actually more domain specific, like registration. So I've seen all of these. I don't think there's really any standard. This is a simple example of an authenticator. This one actually I did lift off the blog post. Yeah, I mean, it almost seems a little too simple to me. Here's a more, this is a bit more complicated one. This comes from our code base where we're handling referral credits for people. It's a rewarder, and as you can see, I've actually got a policy object in here that I delegate to. So it short circuits if the policy isn't met. And then in the run method, you can see basically the three different operations that needed to be tied together for this service object. And one of them, is it this one? One of them, yeah, where is it? Yeah, so right there. So one of them calls out to another service object called the redeemer. So this keeps the rewarder class it only has really one role, is to reward someone and kick off the notification to let them know they've been rewarded. Then it calls out to the redeemer, which will, if a customer, if somebody uses a account's referral code, then the person that used it gets rewarded, or the customer gets rewarded with a credit, and then immediately we try to redeem it if they haven't had, if they don't have a currently redeemed credit on record. And so in this case, we're actually calling out to Stripe to actually apply the coupon for them. So that's an external service, and so we wrap it together in this, and it's also using a policy object as well. So not everybody is a fan of these, and I actually use these quite frequently, and I feel pretty icky about it sometimes. I mean, there's something kind of strange about these classes that have a single method, and Jonas kind of summed it up best, I guess. It does feel kind of procedural and strange, but at the same time, I have improved our code base tremendously just by moving to using these really small service objects. And when new feature requests come in that touch these things, the turnaround is very rapid because my tests are great, it's very well contained, and it's pretty legible what the intent was of the business process. So, you know, we're still learning. These are all trends. I still feel like I'm following the trends. I'm learning as we're going along. These things have provided me value. They may provide you value in some cases too, but I don't think we're totally there yet. I do think I would like to expand my knowledge on domain design, and it feels like a lot of these things are kind of moving away from that. The answer is I'm not quite sure. These things have worked for me so far, but I have a feeling there's probably a new trend coming that may change where we're headed. But CodeClimate is introducing an automated refactoring tool. All those things that I talked about tonight, they will automatically apply to your code base in a new feature that they released on April 1st, actually. So go check it out. That's my talk. So I can answer Scott's questions. maybe at the bar.
Aaron, if you want to get in first.
Mine's a lot easier. I'm just curious. So, taking these patterns, you have an explosion of classes and files, which I think is a lot easier to navigate than just huge files with lots of methods. How do you go about organizing that in your Rails project? Is it all in the models directory, or how do you like to pick this stuff out in a way that you know where to find what you're looking for?
Yeah, so the general trend is to keep everything under apps into separate subdirectories. So forums normally go in app forums, services in app services. The value objects I normally keep in the models directory. They seem okay there. But a lot of these, there's no real standard, but it does feel right to put these under app rather than lib. Lib just seems like, I don't know, it feels like either a place where you're doing something that should eventually become a gem, or just kind of a util directory where people dump stuff in. And it just feels a little more right to put it under app.
I always like to take something, like, if I'm looking for X, right, and I go someplace and look for X there, and it's not there, when I eventually find it, right, I move it back to where I first looked, right, and that tends to kind of be a little more follow the model of least surprise, right? If I was looking for something somewhere, right, chances are someone else on the team is going to look for it there too, so maybe we kind of put it in the wrong place originally.
One thing I should mention actually, so if you have app services, for instance, with the referral credit,
I just put everything in slash code.
So I try to group everything under the domain that they're applying to, and in some cases it seems like you should probably put all your form, everything that's related to referral credit maybe should live under a referral credit directory, even if it's, service objects, if it's form objects, policy objects. So that's another way to do it. It really just, it's completely open-ended, but the trends seem to be form services under app.
So it seems like a lot of these things kind of emerge as you get a clearer and clearer problem, or clearer and clearer view of your problem space and like the actual problem you're solving. As business requirements change, do you find yourself going back and deconstructing like a lot of your service objects, your query objects, those kind of things, and like reworking them often?
Not too often. I think every time you get a feature on existing code, you should be refactoring something. It's the time to do it, because there will not be another time. But generally speaking, unless the requirement is insane and just completely blows away the feature that I just wrote, I found it pretty easy to augment these things. And sometimes it may mean creating another class. I think more classes are better than big classes. Anything else? Okay.
I have.
You want the mic?
We gotta get beers in a little bit.
Since you wrote this blog, so I'll just attack you on all this.
I didn't write the blog post. No, I didn't.
I know, I'm struggling.
All right, cool.
What aside from maybe, what I think is interesting, just about the service object thing, because I find it popping up in apps all over the place. This came up in the domain-driven design community around 2006. In about 2009, the people who were the early innovators, or early influencers, abandoned it as a bad idea. So that's what, five years ago? 5 years ago, along comes Rails. It's now 8 years late, adopting things that have been written off. It's like the message is coming really, really late. Although we don't have to replay the mistake. Again, we don't have to play 3 years of mistake just to get to the fact that already in history this has sort of been seen as a problem.
What did they move them back to? What was the solution? Like if they're like, oh, these are terrible.
There was always a solution. They're just objects. It's just an object. The problem, and it goes to Jonas's I'll just accredit to Theo. It's like that tweet you had of yours about services being procedural. The interesting thing about that is like there's a statement that's not being made in it that objects are supposed to be something other than procedural, right? If they're procedural and procedural's bad, then objects are probably this other thing, right? So what is that other thing?
Well, can I give an example here? So I have this redeemer object. What I could have done is create a redemption model, probably, and save the state of the redemption and probably put this bit of logic in there and created something closer to the domain. So this, I mean, I struggle with this too, but the end result doesn't hurt. And that's really what I'm interested in, is reducing pain in development. And to me, this breaking stuff into smaller classes, regardless of what the role they are, and making it easier to test removes the pain, makes it easier to develop, and that's what I'm interested in.
So there's one other hidden pain here, which is one that's rife through I think our community, which you pointed out early on, with going through the phases of fads from delayed job and everything _ food to the next generation that's everything _ a bowl, and then sidekick, and then rescue and sidekick and all that stuff. There's bad ideas that stick around that hold us. There's fads that stick around to hold us to bad ideas for longer than we should. Right? So that was the issue with service objects. What's discoverable in the end is a service object. Yeah, it's a service, but that's kind of like saying you're a Homo sapien. It's not exactly so important that it needs to be on your driver's license. It doesn't belong in the identity. They're just objects. It's an object of type service, of some class and category of service. But it's so irrelevant to the implementation that it never has to be called out.
Except that it does in this context of Rails.
No, it doesn't, especially if we're taking these things from domain-driven design and saying, great, if it's domain-driven design, we should be organizing our application not around model view controller helper, blah, 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 because these are technical machination concerns of a framework's archetypes. They should be organized around, whatever the concepts are in your application. So if that is a redemption or a redeemer, it's probably not a redeemer, because that's just probably not in the domain, unless you're modeling the apocalypse or something.
Yeah, that could be true.
But so a redeemer is just behavior. Now, I wanted to get back to this thing about behavioral objects and procedural objects. The irony is that if you read about software development, read about OO, you'll see that Rails is the odd man out. That objects are behavioral things, and it's the data objects that are the exception. And objects are supposed to be procedural, but they're just encapsulated procedures. So when you see someone say it feels icky that it's procedural, we're saying it feels icky because I was taught relational databases and that objects were representations of relational database rows, which is the exception to the rule, not the rule. The rule is objects are procedural, behavioral. But we see it another way because active record forces us into that path. And it forces us into all the shitty things like fat model, skinny controller, which was a known bad idea the moment it rolled off somebody's lips. It already violated 3 principal design rules that said we would end up today here reviewing a good article about problems with Rails in a user review. But
it's better than fat controllers.
It's not better than fat controllers. Absolutely not better. In fact, fat controllers are better, and they're mathematically provably better. And the reason for that is I'll tell you why. So call bullshit. I like it. So let's do this.
I think we need some beers for you.
I'll end here.
Yeah, we can cut this short and go to the bar. All you have to do is stand up, walk out.
No, come on. You can't go bullshit and walk out.
No.
Hold on.
The
The issue is just this. There's general purpose things and special purpose things, and it's the fundamental pattern of software development. And in general purpose things, you put general purpose, in general purpose places, you put general purpose things. Special purpose places, you put special purpose things. Controller code is special purpose.
Sure.
Models are general purpose.
I think we have a fundamental vocabulary issue between what a model actually is and what an active record model is.
Well, there's active record has a problem with correlating itself
Yes,
to
it
reality,
does.
period. But
Right.
that doesn't mean that we have to go down this horrible little path.
Right. My point is.
So you rescind your bullshit then?
No, I rescind your mathematically provable.
It's just that
and run a computer.
You put a
well, that's the fucking problem with Rails. Don't blame software. That's
Thanks, guys. Thank you.